The first light of dawn crept across Washington, D.C.'s skyline, filtering through Dr. Aisha Reynolds' meticulously organized Arlington condominium. At 42, she was far more than a federal civil rights attorney. She was a living chronicle of generational resilience, a strategic architect of institutional transformation. Her apartment reflected her professional and personal ethos. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding legal journals, historical texts on systemic inequality, and annotated rulings from landmark civil rights cases. Each volume bore the weight of countless hours spent studying, preparing, and advocating. The minimalist decor, functional yet elegant, spoke of a woman who valued substance over extravagance. Aisha moved through her morning routine with precision. She brewed her coffee, the aroma filling the quiet space, while she scanned the day's schedule on her tablet. Meetings with advocacy groups, a court hearing, and a mentoring session with young attorneys filled the agenda. Her morning run was non-negotiable. Running was her therapy, a sacred hour for reflection and strategy. As her sneakers hit the pavement, her mind wandered to the cases awaiting her attention. Cases of workplace discrimination, voter suppression, and systemic inequities that seemed impervious to time or reform. Aisha's dedication to justice was not born in a vacuum. It was rooted in the legacy of her family. Her great-grandmother had labored in Mississippi's fields. Her grandmother broke barriers as the first in their family to finish high school, and her mother taught in underfunded public schools, emphasizing the transformative power of education. Understand the system before you challenge it, her mother had often told her. Power is in the details. These words shaped Aisha's approach to life and law. She excelled academically, earning her J.D. from Harvard Law School, where she stood out not only for her intellect, but for her unwavering commitment to social justice. As she showered and dressed, she selected a tailored navy blue suit, a statement of authority in a field where perception mattered as much as argument. The gold lapel pin she fastened to her jacket was a gift from her mentor, a retired Supreme Court justice, and bore the inscription, "Justice is relentless." Her phone buzzed with a reminder as she poured her coffee into a travel mug. She glanced at the screen. An early hearing in municipal court to observe a procedural review. It was a relatively minor case, one of many she monitored to stay attuned to local judicial practices. By 7:30 a.m., Aisha was in her car, navigating the morning traffic toward the courthouse. The city hummed with its usual urgency, but her focus remained steady. She rehearsed her notes mentally, anticipating the nuances of the legal arguments she might encounter. At the courthouse, she stepped into the familiar rhythm of the legal world. The smell of polished wood and the faint hum of fluorescent lights greeted her. The courtroom was sparsely populated, with attorneys, clerks, and a few defendants seated in tense anticipation. Aisha's presence commanded attention. Though she wasn't there to argue, her reputation preceded her. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing her as the attorney who had dismantled a discriminatory housing policy last year. Others merely noted her composed demeanor and moved on. As she took a seat, her eyes scanned the room. The presiding judge, a man she'd heard of but never met, exuded an air of casual authority. His body language, leaning slightly back in his chair, fingers drumming on the desk, suggested a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Aisha's mind drifted momentarily. She wasn't expecting much from this case. It was a procedural matter that wouldn't require her input. But as she observed the interactions in the room, subtle patterns began to emerge. Certain defendants, those who seemed less familiar with legal formalities, were met with impatience or dismissiveness. The systemic bias she had spent her career combating was alive and well, even in the minutiae of municipal court proceedings. The morning's proceedings unfolded predictably. Routine motions, minor infractions, and an endless stream of bureaucratic formalities. Aisha remained an observer, jotting occasional notes in the margin of her leather-bound notebook. But as the next case was called, her focus sharpened. Case number 24-308, Johnson v. City of Arlington, the clerk announced. A young black woman in her late 20s approached the defendant's table. Her posture was tense, and her expression revealed a mix of defiance and unease. Her clothes, though neat, betrayed the financial strain she likely endured. A second-hand blazer, scuffed but polished shoes. The judge glanced at the file briefly before addressing her. His tone clipped. Ms. Johnson, you're here today for unpaid parking fines totaling $300. You've been notified several times, yet you failed to resolve this matter. Do you have an explanation? I've been trying, Your Honor, the woman replied. Her voice was steady but tinged with frustration. I was laid off from my job and... The judge raised a hand to cut her off. This court isn't interested in excuses, Ms. Johnson. The law is the law. Either you pay the fine today, or we proceed with further penalties. Aisha felt the familiar churn of anger in her chest. The woman's attempt to explain her circumstances had been dismissed outright, her humanity reduced to a ledger of unpaid fines. Your Honor, Ms. Johnson interjected, her voice rising slightly. I'm not asking for a free pass. I'm asking for time. I've started a new job, and I'll be able to pay next month. The judge sighed audibly. Time doesn't pay city debts, Ms. Johnson. This isn't a charity. Either pay today or prepare for wage garnishment. Aisha's pen paused mid-sentence. She recognized the pattern. The casual cruelty cloaked in procedure. The systemic dehumanization disguised as judicial impartiality. The young woman's face flushed, but she didn't back down. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe the city has options other than penalizing someone who's trying to get back on their feet. This system isn't designed to help people like me. The judge's expression hardened. Careful, Ms. Johnson. I suggest you focus on resolving your debt rather than making baseless accusations about this court's integrity. The tension in the room was palpable. Aisha knew this dynamic well. A powerful authority figure asserting control. An individual forced to navigate the labyrinth of power with limited resources. It was then that Aisha decided to intervene. Rising from her seat, she walked toward the bench with measured steps, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but firm. The judge looked up, visibly surprised. And you are? Dr. Aisha Reynolds, federal civil rights attorney, she replied, producing her credentials with a practiced ease. I'm here as an observer, but I'd like to request a brief recess to discuss procedural fairness. The room fell silent. The judge's initial surprise quickly gave way to irritation. Dr. Reynolds, this is a municipal court. Unless you're representing Ms. Johnson, I don't see how this concerns you. It concerns me deeply, Your Honor, Aisha replied, maintaining her composure. This court's purpose is to uphold justice, not to perpetuate cycles of hardship. I believe a recess would allow for a constructive discussion on how we can align with that purpose. The judge stared at her for a moment, his authority challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. After a pause, he nodded curtly. Very well. 15 minutes. As the court recessed, Aisha approached Ms. Johnson, offering a reassuring smile. May I sit with you? The young woman nodded hesitantly. Thank you for speaking up, she said quietly. I didn't know what else to do. You did exactly what you were supposed to, Aisha replied. But systems like this aren't designed to accommodate people's realities. That's why we're here, to change that narrative. When the session resumed, Aisha stood at the lectern, addressing the court with a measured authority that commanded attention. Your Honor, while I respect the procedural integrity of this court, I must remind everyone present that justice cannot be reduced to a transaction. Ms. Johnson has articulated her willingness to resolve this matter, but penalizing her further would undermine the very principles this institution stands for. The judge folded his arms, his expression guarded. And what exactly do you propose, Doctor? Reynolds, I propose a deferral of the fine, coupled with community service. A solution that acknowledges her financial situation while reinforcing her commitment to accountability. This is not leniency. It's equity. The room held its breath as the judge deliberated. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Motion granted. Ms. Johnson, your fine will be deferred for 90 days, during which time you'll complete 20 hours of community service. Court adjourned. As the gavel struck, Ms. Johnson turned to Aisha, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Aisha smiled, her voice steady. This is just the beginning. But even as she left the courtroom, Aisha's thoughts lingered on the systemic flaws she had witnessed. This wasn't just about one case. It was about dismantling a system that prioritized punishment over understanding. Her resolve hardened. The fight was far from over.
The case weighed heavily on Aisha as she left the courthouse. The morning sun had risen higher, casting a sharp glare on the glass facade of the building. A fitting metaphor, she thought, for the unyielding transparency that systems of power often claimed but rarely practiced. In her car, she sat for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, mind racing. The courtroom exchange had been a victory, albeit a small one. It was a crack in a seemingly impenetrable wall, and Aisha knew she couldn't stop there. The issue wasn't just Ms. Johnson's fines. It was the broader machinery that churned out inequities daily, unnoticed by those who benefited from it, and unchallenged by those too exhausted to fight. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A familiar name lit up the screen. Justice Evelyn Carter, her former mentor and one of the first black women to serve on the Supreme Court. Aisha, the warm, authoritative voice said when she answered. I saw your name in the docket this morning. What happened? Aisha explained the situation succinctly, detailing the judge's dismissive behavior and the resolution she had proposed. Justice Carter listened quietly before responding. You did well. But you know this is just a symptom. The system isn't built to accommodate empathy. It's built to perpetuate control. If you want to make lasting change, you'll need to challenge more than just a single judge. I know, Aisha said, her tone resolute. That's why I'm reaching out to you. This court's practices are a microcosm of a much larger problem. I want to push for systemic reforms, starting with municipal courts. But I'll need allies. You'll have them, Justice Carter replied. But remember, this will be a marathon, not a sprint. Change like this demands persistence and strategy. Are you prepared for that? Aisha didn't hesitate. I've spent my life preparing for it. Justice Carter's laugh was rich with pride. Then let's begin. The conversation with Justice Carter reignited Aisha's drive. That evening, she convened a virtual meeting with colleagues from her civil rights network, laying out her plan. The goal wasn't just to address the behavior of a single judge, but to expose and reform the broader practices that enabled such behavior to thrive. Her first step was to gather data, court transcripts, financial records, and testimonies from individuals like Ms. Johnson, who had been disproportionately affected by punitive municipal court practices. Patterns began to emerge. Over 80% of fines were levied on low-income individuals. Black and Hispanic defendants were significantly more likely to face harsher penalties for minor infractions. Community service programs were rarely offered as alternatives, despite their proven efficacy.
Aisha crafted a report detailing these findings, weaving in personal stories to humanize the statistics. The narrative was clear. The system was not broken. It was functioning precisely as it was designed, prioritizing revenue over rehabilitation and perpetuating cycles of poverty and criminalization. The next step was to bring this issue to the public's attention. Aisha contacted investigative journalists she trusted, sharing the report under embargo to ensure its release would make an impact. Months later, Aisha found herself back in the same courthouse. But this time, the stakes were higher. She had filed a formal complaint against the judge from Ms. Johnson's case, citing patterns of implicit bias and judicial misconduct. The hearing drew significant attention, with local media covering the proceedings and advocacy groups rallying outside the courthouse. Inside, Aisha presented her case with meticulous precision, walking the review board through documented instances of discriminatory rulings and systemic failures. The judge, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to defend his record. "I have always applied the law impartially," he insisted. "Impartiality is meaningless without context, Your Honor," Aisha countered. "The law may be impartial, but its application is shaped by the biases of those who enforce it. Your record shows a pattern of dismissing the lived realities of marginalized individuals in favor of rigid adherence to punitive measures. That is not justice." The room was silent as the weight of her words settled. The board announced it would deliberate, but Aisha already knew this was about more than a single ruling. The fallout was swift. The report Aisha had authored became a rallying cry for reform, sparking discussions across the city and beyond. Municipal courts faced increased scrutiny, with advocacy groups pushing for transparency and accountability. One of the most significant victories came when the city council passed a new ordinance, requiring judges to consider socioeconomic factors in sentencing and to prioritize alternatives like community service over financial penalties. The judge in Ms. Johnson's case was reassigned to a non-adjudicative role, his record permanently tarnished by the revelations. For Aisha, the changes were a testament to the power of collective action, but they also underscored the immense work that remained. Months later, Aisha sat in her office, staring at the framed newspaper headline on her wall: "Civil Rights Attorney Sparks Municipal Court Overhaul." Below it was a photo of her standing with Ms. Johnson and other community members outside the courthouse, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and triumph. The young woman's life had turned around. She had completed her community service, paid her deferred fine, and now worked as an advocate for others navigating the same system that had nearly crushed her. Aisha smiled faintly, but her mind was already racing with the next challenge. Justice was relentless, and so was she.
As Aisha leaned back in her chair, the weight of progress felt both satisfying and sobering. She had achieved a meaningful victory, but the fight was far from over. The systemic inequities she had exposed were deeply entrenched, woven into the fabric of policies and practices that continued to harm marginalized communities. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from a local college professor who ran a civic engagement program. The subject line read, "Invitation to speak, inspiring the next generation of advocates." Aisha opened the message and scanned its contents. The professor was requesting her presence as the keynote speaker at an upcoming event aimed at empowering young legal minds to challenge systemic injustice. She smiled, recognizing the opportunity to inspire others, as she had been inspired by Justice Carter years ago. Her response was immediate. "I would be honored." A few weeks later, Aisha stood before a packed auditorium. The students' faces were a mix of curiosity, determination, and cautious optimism. Many of them had already encountered the barriers she was fighting to dismantle. financial hardship, systemic discrimination, and the burden of proving themselves in spaces not built for them. Taking a deep breath, Aisha began. When I was younger, I believed that the law was a tool of fairness, a neutral arbiter of justice. But as I grew older and stepped into the courtroom, I realized something much more profound. The law is only as just as the people who wield it. She paused, letting the words sink in. Injustice doesn't persist because of one bad judge or one flawed policy. It persists because systems are designed to favor some while disadvantaging others. Changing those systems is not just about winning cases. It's about rewriting the rules, challenging the norms, and most importantly, empowering those who've been silenced. Aisha shared the story of Ms. Johnson, detailing not only the courtroom battle but also the systemic ripple effects that followed. She spoke about the importance of leveraging data, building coalitions, and maintaining resilience in the face of resistance.
But above all, she concluded, justice requires courage. The courage to speak up when others remain silent, to act when others hesitate, and to believe in change even when it feels impossible. You are that change. You are the architects of a more equitable future. The room erupted in applause, but what struck Aisha most were the quiet nods of understanding from students who saw their own struggles reflected in her words. The momentum from her speech carried forward. The civic engagement program saw a surge in applications, and several students reached out to Aisha for mentorship. She began hosting monthly workshops, teaching young advocates how to navigate the legal system while maintaining their integrity and humanity. Ms. Johnson joined Aisha at one of these workshops, sharing her experience and highlighting the importance of compassion within systems of power. Her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that behind every case was a human being with a story worth fighting for. Late one evening, Aisha found herself revisiting a letter her mother had written to her during law school. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but the words remained as powerful as ever. Aisha, you carry the weight of our family's history, but you also carry its dreams. Remember, the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always necessary. When you feel tired, look back not to rest, but to remember why you started. She folded the letter carefully, her resolve renewed. The battles she fought were not just for Ms. Johnson or herself. They were for the generations before her and the ones yet to come. As Aisha turned off her desk lamp and gazed out at the city skyline, she thought of all the untold stories still waiting to be heard, the injustices still waiting to be challenged. Her work was far from finished, but that didn't daunt her. It fueled her. Because in every courtroom, in every speech, in every act of advocacy, Aisha knew she wasn't just seeking justice. She was redefining it. Over the following months, the momentum Aisha had ignited began to ripple outward. Her casework expanded from municipal court reform to addressing broader systemic inequities, including police misconduct and unfair housing practices. Each case, each fight, became part of a larger tapestry of change. Local communities started organizing their own initiatives, inspired by Aisha's unrelenting drive. Neighborhood forums blossomed into advocacy groups, demanding transparency and equity from the institutions that serve them. A coalition of civil rights attorneys and grassroots activists began working together under the banner "Justice for All," a phrase Aisha had once used in a speech. Media coverage of her work intensified. A feature in the New York Times highlighted her as a relentless force in the fight against systemic injustice, and she was invited to speak at national conferences on legal reform. But Aisha remained grounded, often redirecting the spotlight toward the communities and individuals who had inspired her journey. The movement reached a critical juncture when Aisha and her team filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against the city's judiciary, accusing it of perpetuating economic exploitation through discriminatory fines and fees. The lawsuit was unprecedented in scope, targeting not only individual judges, but also the financial frameworks that incentivize their punitive practices. The trial garnered national attention, with courtroom proceedings broadcast on major news networks. Aisha, standing before a packed room of reporters and spectators, delivered her opening statement with measured precision. This case is not just about numbers. It is about lives. About the countless individuals who have been reduced to statistics by a system designed to extract from them rather than empower them. Today, we challenge not only the practices but the principles that allow such a system to exist. Justice should never come with a price tag. The trial lasted weeks, with expert witnesses, testimonies from affected individuals, and reams of data supporting Aisha's claims. The defense, backed by powerful institutional interests, attempted to paint the lawsuit as overreach, but Aisha's meticulous preparation left little room for rebuttal. When the ruling finally came, it was a watershed moment. The court found the city's judiciary guilty of systemic bias and ordered sweeping reforms, including the abolition of predatory fines and fees, mandatory bias training for judges and court staff, the establishment of independent oversight committees to monitor judicial practices. The decision was hailed as a victory for civil rights, with legal scholars calling it a landmark case in the fight for equitable justice. For Aisha, it was a validation of years of relentless effort, but she saw it as just one step in a much longer journey. Through it all, Aisha found herself evolving, not just as a lawyer but as a leader, a mentor, and a storyteller. She began chronicling her experiences in a memoir, Unequal Scales: My Fight for Justice in a Biased System. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers from all walks of life. In her personal life, Aisha also found balance. The weight of her work had often left little room for relationships, but she began to nurture deeper connections with family and friends, finding solace and strength in their unwavering support. One evening, as she attended a community event celebrating the reforms, a young girl approached her. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, her voice tinged with awe, "I want to be just like you when I grow up." Aisha knelt down, meeting the girl's eyes. "You don't have to be like me," she said gently. "You just have to believe in yourself and stand up for what's right. That's how we change the world." Years later, Aisha's work would be credited with catalyzing a national movement for judicial reform. Her name became synonymous with integrity and courage, her efforts a blueprint for those who came after her. Sitting in her office late one night, reviewing the latest policy proposal from the Justice for All Coalition, Aisha reflected on the long road she had traveled. The fight had been grueling, the challenges immense, but the victories, both big and small, had made every moment worthwhile. As she looked out at the city she had dedicated her life to transforming, Aisha felt a deep, abiding sense of purpose. The work was far from over, but she wouldn't have it any other way. Because for Aisha Reynolds, justice was not just an ideal. It was a lifelong commitment, a legacy in progress. As Aisha's career advanced, she turned her attention to cultivating the next generation of leaders. Recognizing that systemic change required a broad coalition of voices, she expanded her mentorship programs and created scholarships for law students from underrepresented communities. The Reynolds Fellowship for Justice, funded through the proceeds from her memoir and speaking engagements, became a prestigious award for aspiring civil rights attorneys. The fellowship didn't just provide financial support. It included a rigorous mentorship program where recipients worked directly on cases involving systemic injustice. Aisha also partnered with Justice Carter to establish the Equal Justice Institute, a think tank dedicated to studying systemic bias and proposing actionable reforms. The institute became a beacon for researchers, lawyers, and policymakers, producing groundbreaking reports and innovative solutions to entrenched legal inequities. One day, as Aisha wrapped up a meeting at the Equal Justice Institute, she received an unexpected call from the White House. The president's chief of staff informed her that she was being considered for a nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals. The news left Aisha momentarily speechless. It was a rare opportunity to influence the legal system from the bench, a chance to bring her lifelong fight for justice to one of the highest levels of the judiciary. But it was also a daunting prospect, requiring her to leave behind the direct advocacy work that had defined her career. She sought advice from her closest confidants, including Justice Carter. "You've always said that the law is only as just as the people who wield it," Justice Carter reminded her. "This is your chance to wield it at its most influential level. But the decision must come from your heart." After weeks of reflection, Aisha accepted the nomination. Her confirmation process was intense, with both supporters and critics scrutinizing her record. But her unwavering integrity and undeniable expertise ultimately won over the Senate.
As a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals, Aisha brought the same level of dedication and empathy that had defined her career. Her rulings were meticulously reasoned, often citing not only legal precedent, but also the broader societal implications of her decisions. She became known for her sharp intellect and her ability to navigate complex cases with fairness and compassion. Her presence on the bench sent a powerful message. Representation mattered. For countless individuals who had felt excluded from the legal system, seeing Aisha in such a prominent role was a source of inspiration and hope. Decades later, as Aisha prepared to retire, she reflected on the arc of her life. The fight for justice had taken her from courtroom battles to systemic reforms, from mentoring young advocates to shaping the law at the highest levels. Her journey had been one of relentless determination, fueled by a deep belief in the power of individuals to create meaningful change. In her farewell address to the Equal Justice Institute, she spoke directly to the next generation. Change is not a single act. It is a sustained effort. It is the quiet persistence of everyday people refusing to accept injustice as the norm. My hope for you is that you never lose sight of your power to make a difference. Because every step you take toward justice, no matter how small, brings us closer to the world we deserve. As she left the stage to a standing ovation, Aisha knew her work would live on, not just in the laws she had helped to shape, but in the countless lives she had touched. For Aisha Reynolds, the fight for justice was never about individual victories. It was about building a legacy of hope, resilience, and transformation. A legacy that would continue to inspire generations to come.
In the years that followed her retirement, Aisha found herself quietly reflecting on the path she had taken. She had lived through moments of profound change, both personal and societal. As she moved away from the daily grind of law and advocacy, her thoughts often turned to the many people she had met along the way, those whose stories had shaped her perspective and informed her actions. Though she no longer served on the bench, Aisha's commitment to justice never wavered. Her life had been built on the understanding that the law was both a tool and a mirror, a reflection of society's values and a means of shaping them. She continued to speak at conferences, to write articles, and to meet with young advocates who sought her guidance. One morning, as she sipped her tea on the balcony of her Arlington home, she thought back to that first courtroom moment, the one where Ms. Johnson's case had ignited her passion for justice. It had felt like a singular event then, a point in time that would define her career. But now, looking back, Aisha saw it as just one piece of a much larger mosaic. A story of persistence. A story of systems shifting under the weight of collective action. She had helped dismantle barriers, But she also understood that the struggle for justice was never static. Systems evolved, but so too did the injustices they perpetuated. There was always more work to be done, more lives to be touched, more laws to be changed. Aisha's impact was most visible in the people she mentored. Many of her former fellows had gone on to lead their own movements, securing rights for marginalized communities and challenging the very systems Aisha had fought to reform. In cities across the country, young attorneys carried her principles into their own practice, armed with the tools she had imparted to them. They brought lawsuits challenging police brutality, demanded reforms in the criminal justice system, and organized with grassroots movements to change the lives of people who had been ignored for far too long. As she sat with her former fellows, now colleagues and allies, at an annual gathering of the Reynolds Fellowship, Aisha saw the fruit of her labor. One of the fellows, a woman named Maya, stood up and shared the case she had won that year. An unprecedented settlement for a group of former prisoners who had been unjustly incarcerated. Maya's success wasn't just a legal victory. It was a testament to Aisha's legacy, a reflection of how one person's dedication could spread across generations. Aisha smiled, proud of the future unfolding before her. She had not just shaped the law. She had helped shape a generation of warriors for justice. And that, in the end, was her most enduring achievement. It was a cold winter morning when Aisha officially closed the doors on her law practice and bid farewell to the Equal Justice Institute. She had always known that one chapter would end and another would begin. But even as she retired from her professional life, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that her work would continue to reverberate across the nation. One final phone call came through that morning. Aisha, it's Karen. We've got an idea for a new initiative. It's time to start focusing on the next stage of systemic change, and we think you're the right person to guide it. Are you in? Aisha took a deep breath, smiling. She knew the answer immediately. The work never truly ended. It simply evolved. Yes, Karen. I'm in. A few months later, Aisha stood on the steps of the newly opened Justice Center for Change, a community-based organization dedicated to the future of legal and social reform. It was a project she had spearheaded, collaborating with activists, lawmakers, and educators to create a space for public dialogue and policy innovation. The center would serve as a think tank for tackling emerging issues in criminal justice, civil rights, and systemic inequality. As she looked around, she could see the same energy she had felt all those years ago in the courtroom, the energy of people who believed that change was possible. Aisha's story had come full circle. Her life, now encapsulated in the work of others, had taken on a new dimension, a living testament to the power of resistance, resilience, and redemption. And so, as she stepped back from the podium, a quiet, unwavering certainty settled within her. This was not the end of her journey, nor would it be the end of the fight for justice. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would continue to stand, not just as a witness to history, but as a vital part of its ongoing transformation. Because for Aisha Reynolds, justice was never about the destination. It was always about the journey and the countless steps, no matter how small, that it took to get there. Her legacy was not a single victory, but the ongoing fight to reshape the systems that would define the future. And in that fight, she had laid the groundwork for a world that, one day, might just be a little bit fairer, a little bit kinder, and a whole lot more just.
Years passed, but Aisha's influence never faded. As the Justice Center for Change flourished, so did the ripple effects of her life's work. New generations of activists, lawyers, and scholars grew inspired by her story, each carrying the torch of justice a little further.
Aisha's name became synonymous with the concept of systemic transformation, not as a single-handed savior, but as a catalyst for collective action. Through her mentorship, Aisha had imparted not only the technical aspects of the law, but the ethos of resilience, how to persist in the face of entrenched systems that seemed insurmountable. But perhaps the most profound lesson she left behind was one of humility, that justice was a communal effort, built not on individual accolades, but on the shared commitment to a greater good. One afternoon, as Aisha walked through the streets of Washington, D.C., on her way to the Justice Center, she was approached by a familiar face. It was the young girl she had met years ago at a community event, the one who had dreamed of becoming like her. Now, the girl, now a woman, stood before her, holding a legal brief. "Mrs. Reynolds," the woman said, voice filled with gratitude, "I wanted to thank you. I'm about to argue my first case in front of the Supreme Court, and I wouldn't be here without your guidance." Aisha took a moment to absorb the weight of her words. It had always been about the next generation, and seeing someone she had mentored rise to such a pivotal moment filled her with an indescribable pride. "I'm proud of you," Aisha said softly. "You've earned this moment. Go show them what you're made of." That evening, the woman's name appeared in news headlines. Young attorney wins landmark civil rights case. Aisha, now far removed from the courtroom, took a quiet moment to reflect. It was not a direct victory for her, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the ideals she had fought for the change she had helped to create, for the future she had paved.
A few years before her death, Aisha sat in the front row at the dedication of a new civil rights building, an institution that bore her name. It had been funded by the very coalition she had once helped to build, a place where young advocates and scholars could gather to continue the work she had started. As the crowd stood to honor her, Aisha felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had never sought recognition, and yet here she was, surrounded by a community that not only acknowledged her work, but would carry it forward. Her life had been about breaking barriers, but as the years passed, it became clear that the greatest barrier she had broken was not one that stood in front of her, but one that stood in front of those who followed. She had cleared the path, so others could walk it with confidence, conviction, and, most importantly, with the knowledge that they were never alone. Her legacy was not defined by the courtroom battles or legal victories, but by the enduring impact she had on the hearts and minds of those who had been inspired by her work. It was seen in the children who grew up hearing stories of how one person could make a difference, and it was seen in the attorneys who carried on her commitment to justice. In her final days, Aisha Reynolds reflected on her journey with a sense of gratitude. She had fought not for the applause, not for the recognition, but for the simple belief that everyone deserved equal access to justice. And in that fight, she had succeeded, not just in winning cases, but in changing hearts, minds, and systems. Her life was proof that the struggle for justice is not a singular event, but a continual process, and that no matter where one starts, the journey toward equity and fairness is always worth taking. Aisha had walked that path, and in doing so, had shown countless others how to walk it too. Her legacy, woven into the very fabric of the movement for justice, would live on, not as a monument, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of resilience, dedication, and unwavering belief in a better, fairer world. As Aisha's health began to decline, she spent more time reflecting on the essence of her journey. Despite the accolades and public recognition, it was the quieter moments, conversations with young lawyers, private discussions with her mentees, and the slow yet steady progress in courtrooms and communities that sustained her. In her final days, Aisha decided to write a letter. It was a letter addressed to her former fellows, those she had mentored and guided over the years. It was a final message of hope, resilience, and purpose, an invitation to continue the fight for justice in the ways they each saw fit. To my dear colleagues, friends, and future advocates of justice, by the time you read this letter, I will have completed the final chapter of my journey. And though my voice may no longer echo in the halls of the courts or in the chambers of the Justice Center, my thoughts and hopes for each of you remain strong and clear. I've spent my life in pursuit of a singular truth: that justice, in its truest form, is not merely a legal concept. It is a moral imperative that requires every one of us to show up, to act, and to persist. But it's more than just winning cases or achieving tangible results. It is about the unwavering belief that we can build a better, more equitable world. One where systems do not work to oppress, but to empower. I'm proud of the work we've done together, proud of the victories we've won, and the ones we have yet to win. But more than anything, I am proud of the way you have all carried this torch. You've demonstrated that the path to justice is not an easy one. It requires tenacity, heart, and a profound commitment to the truth. Please, continue this work. There will be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the world feels unbearable. In those times, remember that the fight is never only about the present moment. It is about the future you are shaping. I once told you that education is your most powerful weapon. But I also want to add this: your humanity is your greatest strength. Always act with empathy. Listen to those whose voices are silenced. Stand firm in the face of adversity. But never forget the faces of the people you are fighting for. This is not just a career. This is a calling. I've always believed that true change begins when we reach beyond ourselves, when we look at the bigger picture and recognize the inherent value of every life. I trust you to continue this work with the same passion and integrity you have shown me throughout the years. Thank you for walking this path with me, for believing, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, that justice is worth the fight. Until we meet again, may you never stop pushing, never stop striving, and never stop believing in the power of your own actions. I'll be with you in every case you argue, in every policy you challenge, and in every life you touch. With all my love and respect, Aisha Reynolds. Months after Aisha's passing, her influence was still deeply felt in every corner of the justice movement. Her former fellows, now established leaders in their own right, gathered for an annual conference dedicated to her legacy. It was more than just a tribute. It was a call to action. One of the keynote speakers, a young lawyer named Devante, had once been a quiet intern in Aisha's office. He spoke passionately about Aisha's impact on his life and career. "She didn't just teach us the law," Devante said, his voice steady and firm. "She taught us how to be human, how to fight for what's right, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. She taught us that our work is about making others' voices heard. It's about ensuring that every person, no matter their background, gets the same shot at justice." Devante's speech was followed by the unveiling of a new initiative, the Aisha Reynolds Institute for Legal Reform. It was a new think tank, one that would focus on the intersection of law and social justice, and continue the work that Aisha had pioneered throughout her career. The Institute would focus on pushing for new policies aimed at combating systemic bias in legal proceedings, reforming mass incarceration, and addressing racial inequality within the justice system. The Institute's first report, released that year, was groundbreaking. It focused on the need for comprehensive reforms in sentencing laws that disproportionately affected Black and brown communities. The recommendations were bold and wide-reaching, pushing lawmakers to reconsider long-standing policies that had perpetuated inequality. Years passed, and the ripple effects of Aisha's work continued to spread. The Justice Center for Change, the Aisha Reynolds Fellowship, and the Aisha Reynolds Institute all became integral parts of the fight for civil rights and legal reform. It became clear that Aisha had not just been a part of the movement. She had shaped it. Her name was no longer just associated with individual cases or legislative victories. It had become synonymous with a broader vision of justice, a vision that stretched far beyond the confines of courtrooms and legal textbooks and touched every aspect of society. Her legacy lived on not just in the words written about her, but in the lives she had touched and the system she had helped to transform. Through her actions, Aisha Reynolds had proven that one person, armed with resilience and integrity, could ignite a movement capable of changing the world. Aisha Reynolds' journey was never about personal recognition. It was about fighting for a just society, where all people were treated with fairness and dignity. Her life's work, though marked by many challenges, had ultimately changed the course of history. She had not only fought for the underrepresented, but had empowered others to do the same. As the world continued to evolve, the need for change remained, but Aisha had laid the foundation for a better future. A future where justice was no longer a privilege, but a right for all. And in that legacy, Aisha's fight for a fairer world would never end. It would live on in the hearts and actions of those she had inspired.